Welcome to the Peace is Possible podcast, a space for real talk on healing, leadership, and conscious change. I'm Eva Dalak, founder of Peace Activation and your host. Each episode brings you insights and tools to help you live and lead from a place of inner peace and ripple that peace outward. Tune in, reflect, activate. Subscribe whenever you listen to podcasts and visit peaceactivation.org to learn more. Welcome, Lena. Welcome to the Peace is Possible podcast. I'm very excited to have you here as a dear friend, colleague, and just an inspirational leader. So welcome.
Thank you, Eva. I'm honored to be here, and I always learn something in conversation with you, so it's mutual.
Would you please introduce yourself to our audiences?
My name is Lena. I identify most of all as someone who wakes up excited about the promise of change. I really believe that the world isn't how it always needs to be. And I find enormous joy in looking for where and how might we enter those cracks or strengthen those people who are able to take things forward, sometimes maybe not even knowing they can. And so I don't believe that the world is like just one thing baked, cooked for good. I believe it's a meal unfolding that we're making and preparing each and every day. I often describe my journey as someone who, even while I was studying, was really concerned about social justice and became an activist when I was at university, fighting against apartheid, which seemed to be the most horrific injustice on the planet in South Africa, and was just really called to do something about it. So after I carved and created my studies to focus on that, I ended up landing as a volunteer with an independent anti-apartheid newspaper in KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. I hadn't even studied journalism, and yet it felt suddenly like a match of both my passions and my purpose.
You moved from New York to South Africa.
So I grew up in New York and then studied at Stanford in California. And it was while I was there that I was active in student government and student movements. I left university a few times just to volunteer with groups that were supporting the African National Congress in its fight against apartheid, and managed to find myself some kind of fund to pay my ticket to South Africa, and landed there in the middle of 1990, about a month after Nelson Mandela had been released from prison. And there was still years ahead of work to actually get to the first ever democratic elections in 1994. And so from an activism, then fell in love with journalism, worked as a journalist for about 10 years. And then in 2001, out of a calling to feel like there could be more that I could offer towards people struggling with violent conflict, I reached out to Search for Common Ground and said, can I help? The whole early part of my career was never me applying for a job, but just going to where I thought I wanted to be of service and offering myself. And most of the time that landed me with a job. And that's exactly what I did in joining Search for Common Ground, doing a lot of media work, and then learning more and more about peace building. And then this last chapter of really beginning to see, after years of producing radio drama, TV drama, reality shows, game shows, all kinds of ways that media could affect the way we understand conflict and ourselves in that conflict, realizing that, tech and the digital space was here. And that as peace builders, we needed to understand that. How is conflict manifesting online, and what can we do about it using technology? And that's really the space that I'm in today, still as a peace builder, but really seeing technology as something undeniable that we need to understand and use in a positive and constructive way.
Wow, Lena, just so impressive. And I feel like you're a peace activator, even if you call yourself as peace builder. I think when we met in Burundi, because I used to also work for Search for Common Ground, and that's
where we met originally, I think 2005 or something like that, 20 years ago. It's been 20 years. And I remember that beyond the work that we were doing at Search, we also spent some times in the local community and you drumming and helping teaching some of the youth there to drum. And I would dance. And I remember already then, I didn't have the words for it, but I think that was peace activation. That was really how do we activate peace inside out and how our work, our passion is part of our life. It's not a job. It's something that we do as of coming from service, from heart, and because there's no other way to do. There's no other way to go around it because it just seems so obvious that this is how we serve. This is how we serve ourselves, but also the others. And mainly when we gift ourselves, our time, our energy, our creativity to local communities and seeing how can we actually bring the best out of people. I remember I was so inspired by you and ever since we carved this beautiful friendship. And now with Peace Activation, you've been really very supportive from the start. So I would like to invite you. What is for you Peace Activation? Like you've joined some of our meetings and you shared with me like some of your insight around what I'm doing and what Peace Activation is doing, whether in Palestine, Israel, or in the online gathering. And I was really touched by the way you perceive it. So I would love for you to share it with us.
I think that there's a seed that I have always held to be true without always naming it activation, but
Mm-hmm.
really seeing that people can always change. One of the honors I had during the years I've been with Search for Common Ground was to codify this common ground approach, to really say when we're trying to enable people to step into that space, and place, and power of being able to transform conflict, what are the key things that we need to hold as our beliefs? And one of the things I was always so proud of is this idea that everyone can change and everyone can make new choices. And to get to that, it's a process of really helping people firstly understand that others who may have done horrific, horrible things, even those who may have used violence against people we love, came to that space through a journey that we can understand and get to know that can give us then the ability to accept when they make new choices. And because I started really my plunge into peace building in the Great Lakes region, in the aftermath of the Rwandan genocide in Burundi, where hundreds of thousands of people were killed, often by people they knew, this question of reconciliation and making new choices for yourself and allowing others to make new choices was always so important because this was a particular conflict where it wasn't other airstrikes or things leading to this horrific death. It was hand-to-hand combat. And so that idea of activation is about what do I need to understand about the other? And then how do I also bring that grace to myself to allow and encourage the change in myself, to be ready and able to take on new relationships, make new choices, see things differently than the way I grew up, than the way I was taught, than the way it's always been. And so I'm saying that I see the real compelling part of activation as an engine of change and the ability to take a step in a different direction. And whether it's the peace building programs or you were mentioning music, music puts us into a sphere of human interaction that's nonverbal, that can make us feel things that we may not be able to hear, but that we can feel. And that also then made people more ready to be with others that they may otherwise not have wanted to or feared or just felt as though it wasn't worth the risk.
Thank you for that. Yeah, codifying the common ground approach. I remember that chapter. For me, when I came to Burundi, it was actually to create the training manual for search for common ground in Burundi and understand what is this common ground approach? What is it? How different is it from traditional conflict transformation? And I think a lot of my own foundation are coming from common ground. This was my first job and passion, because when I arrived to common ground, I was like, oh my God, I arrived home. This is actually how it would feel if instead of fighting, we understand the difference and work on the commonalities. I thought that sentence that Search for Common Ground was going by was like amazing at the time. And I remember that I was arriving to Burundi straight after the second Intifada, when I was deceived by the Middle East program and feeling that I really needed to get out of my own boxes, my own prejudice and judgment on the situation, on the conflict, on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and see how do other conflict do it? How do other conflict are solved? How do other people in other parties interact? Because I felt that I was constantly triggered and constantly in judgment, and I couldn't work anymore as neutral party in the program. And I remember the first field program I joined was Burundi after the Middle East program. And I remember sitting in Burundi, in Bujumbura, with the theater play that at the time Frédéric Leconte was doing for Théâtre Réconciliation, and this scene where Hutu and Tutsi were competing over suffering. Do you remember that scene? And I remember I was seeing it and I was crying and I was like, oh my God, this is exactly what happens. This is exactly what happens in my own hometown, in my homeland. And that's why I'm not able actually to work there, because we're constantly competing over suffering, over victimhood, who's more victim. And that was really formative for me. Like, it was really kind of an initiation of also staying with you and seeing how you're interacting and how you're creating this program and how this belief that a human being can change even after a genocide. I think that was one of the most mind-blowing insight that I had at the time. And then my journey brought me to do spiritual psychology at the University of Santa Monica 7 years later. And I remember when we were doing the common ground approach, codifying it later on, a lot of what I have evolved in my thinking was, how do we make that conflict transformation from within? How do we integrate the University of Santa, the spiritual psychology tools that I was learning into something that defined as conflict transformation? Like, how do we integrate this essence of heart-centered listening that is different from active listening? How do we integrate this soul-based peace building that is different than just peace building? And that journey had led me actually to peace activation and had led me to really, when October 7 happened, to decide and like, okay, now I'm ready to hold these triggers. Now I'm ready to hold that space for myself, but also for others that are not able to do that, because I know why they're not able to do that, because I wasn't able to do that. I wasn't able to hold multiple truths at the time. It took me years of inner work and outer work and a lot of this combination. And so for me, your thinking, the way, the leadership that you hold and the way you view how people interact and how people can change and where is this gap. I think what I see with you is that you often see the gap between where people are at and where they can be, and you hold the vision for where they can be all along, even while they're not seeing that. And I think that's so impressive. That's so honoring for the individuals that are going through this crisis. And so can you say more about that? Because I think that your own journey in going through different leadership program, doing different things and really experimenting. I see you like a walking laboratory, exploratory, always exploring new thinking, new technique, new anything for Lena, so that you can push yourself to the edge. And that's really inspiring. So would you say more?
I mean, two things that strike me listening to you, Eva. The first is that I just want to really acknowledge that the journey that you've been on has helped us see how that the need for acceptance of oneself by oneself and by others is an affair of the heart and the soul.
Yeah.
It's not a flip chart. It's not sticky notes. It's not some conflict analysis. And I think that's really important and sometimes can be overlooked. And when we're able, whether it's across the racial divide or the tribal divide in South Africa or in Burundi, or across the lines of division in Sudan, or between women and members of the Taliban in Afghanistan, like everyone is entering this next day feeling that thirst for love and acceptance, feeling that wanting to be heard and understood. And some of the peace builders of Search for Common Ground in Afghanistan, when they've offered that to members of the Taliban, they've witnessed transformation because it unlocks our shared humanity.
Yeah.
And it makes people see something that otherwise was hidden from view. So there is really something that is essential and grounding. And of course, when you then look at what trauma and that field of understanding trauma tells us, we know even more how important that is. So I just really want to say that the foundation on which you're building peace activation with that acknowledgement is really essential. The second thing is that you've mentioned I was a percussionist and a musician for decades, playing with all kinds of different musical and dance groups in Africa, and then effectively facilitating and teaching both in South Africa and in the Great Lakes region, festivals, drumming, music, all kinds of things. So I also really do believe that creativity and imagination is something that helps us to be able to see that change and those potential cracks as exciting as the food for future creations. And so I've embraced creativity. I've always seen this idea of imagination and helping people to see a vision and work with it using artistic ways and approaches as really powerful. Both journalists and theater practitioners and artists and musicians, I think, have been some of the most powerful people that have taught me these lessons. And we often can find ourselves denigrating or dismissing creativity and imagination. We are often rewarded for a more analytical, fact-based view of things. And yet that often holds us back from seeing where our lines of perception can meet.
Absolutely. I think that the creativity and imagination is the foundation for anything, actually, even for the analytical work, because I feel like that's the part of our brain that is actually, it's like the feminine aspect of our own being that has been pushed to the side with this trait of inclusivity, of participatory, of openness, of softness, tenderness. Like this feminine quality has been denigrated from this space because we feel like external security is more important. And I remember when I was working for the UN in the gender peacekeeping mission, and we were doing a whole training manual on security. And we got to this questioning of who is defining the security? What is the security? And is it defined the same way by women? And how we've been working so hard. I was working on gender issues, how we were working so hard to get women more into the masculine spaces versus deconstructing those spaces and really flipping the table, even the negotiation table. And how do we integrate the whole of us, the masculine and the feminine? And it's not because one is better than the other. It's just that then we become whole. And I think where we are heading now is towards this integration. It's the same integration for me. That's the peace activation, is the integration of the solid conflict transformation, peace building field and the spiritual psychology field and the somatic experiencing that is touching towards the body. That's really body, mind, soul coming together to understand that when we take ourselves, our being holistically, then we can interact with the other as one. And that oneness is what connects all of us, regardless of what we're doing. And I think that is not really possible to do unless we have creativity and imagination. Like imagination is the weapon of creativity. That's where it starts. And so This brings me to where you are now, which is also require a lot of creativity and imagination because you're really looking ahead, far ahead. And tell us more about where you're at now and the link between peace building and tech.
Yeah, for sure. As I said, from being an activist and then a journalist, I was very passionate about media. And we did so many things because our work was coming against the backdrop of Radio Mille Collines, which had broadcast hatred and was really seen as a contributor to motivating people to see the others as less than human and contributing to the genocide. And these years of really thinking, wait a second, it's not media that's the problem, it's how we design it and how we begin to create programs that help people to see the other in our shared humanity, to feel as though we have agency, to have joy in learning and revealing, again, what we share through all these different kinds of shows. I think that is such a key set of insights when I now look at technology. So as we look at technology, we ask ourselves, is the conflict that we see online the same conflict that we're experiencing in our real lives? And it's actually not.
No.
And when I look online and see how conflict is manifesting, it raised a whole lot of questions. And many people, when they look at conflict online, their conclusion is that there's a lot of really nasty people, and we should teach them how to be nice. And if they're not nice, we should shut them up and take their content down. And through a journey over the last few years of really working with such incredibly generous, talented technologists, people who have built and tried to create safe experiences within Meta platforms and Instagram and X and Twitter and all of those, I've come to learn that the reason why conflict is manifesting the way it is online is because of the design of that technology and what it incentivizes. And when you're rewarded from putting out outrage and hatred, you're going to do that more. And when the platform gains from people's being drawn into addictive feeds that are focused on outrage and hatred, then polarization is the outcome. And so it began to be very clear that even though a piece of our work with Search for Common Ground and other local partners was digital literacy and sort of fact checking and trying to be more aware of how do you navigate in that conflict online? How do you keep yourself safe? If you want to be heard a little bit more, what might be some strategies to do so effectively? It also just became very clear that there was a bigger question about the design of this technology. And that's where, from my work in supporting digital peace building, working with so many other organizations, creating communities of practice, that we eventually launched this council on tech and social cohesion, which was really a moment of insight between peace builders and technologists saying, we're not paying attention enough to how this technology is ripping us apart, making us unable to see the humanity of the other, making the world appear as though there's no common ground. And the effect of that is just a real urgent problem. And so over these last few years, I've been co-chairing this Council on Tech and Social Cohesion, and we've been advancing what we call pro-social design, because most of the technology we experience is antisocial, from its business model of taking your data without permission, from the way that you're the way that you're invited into spaces and made quite vulnerable and visible without understanding what that means, thus subject to unwanted contact and content, as well as what it's incentivizing. And so the Council on Tech and Social Cohesion has been advancing this idea that we can make different choices in the way that we design technologies, particularly social media. And now when we look at AI, similarly, there can be things that can be quite helpful with AI, but there also are real things that we need to be cautious about that could really affect and perhaps even determine very negative things in terms of our human relationships and the way that we understand each other, and then the way we collaborate, and the way we manage to make decisions together, which seems just so hard in this world today.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because I think that work is so necessary because it's true, people get polarized so easily just watching their screen and forwarding and liking. And once you get more likes, and then the way the algorithm work. And I like one of the first project that Peace Activation have done was with 1 Million Truths around AI technology to see what is actually happening in the field. And we have run a story collection program where we collected story from Palestine and Israel, including Gaza, the West Bank, and Israel, different towns in Israel. And what we noticed was, first of all, we didn't expect to have stories from Gaza. And we actually had most story from Gaza. People really felt the need to share where they were at, understandably. But also we saw how they all actually wanted normal life. There was the peace activists that were like, some of the story were about, let's just fight this and create peace and work together and we can make it, etc. And really a lot of activism those. But there were also the traumatized people that were like so much in trauma over what happened in Israel on October 7th, over what was happening in Gaza with the genocide, over what was happening in the West Bank, and that just were completely closed and frozen in the response. And then there were these people that just wanted normal life. They didn't care about the conflict. They didn't care about the land. They didn't care who owns the land. They didn't care about anything but living life normally, in peace and harmony with one another, and drinking, eating, and celebrating life together over any of the others. And it was really very clear, the three parts in the stories, like we had 180 stories, something like that. And once we go further in, we realize that nobody wakes up in the morning and say, hey, I want to kill someone today, or I want to hate someone. These are all trauma responses that we have been ignoring throughout, I don't know, maybe more than hundreds of years. And that they are deflected and then reflected back in different area of the world. And that's what is interesting in your background and my background, is that we've been through so many different conflict zones. We've worked across so many divide. And I think that's what gives us hope in the human. That's what gives me hope in humanity, because I know people can change. I've seen it happening in different places, in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, in Rwanda, in Burundi, in Congo, in Angola, like in all these different places that we've worked, we've seen people change. So it is possible. And the question is then, what makes that change possible? What makes peace possible? Because it is here, it's possible, but the perception is that it's not. The perception is that I need to fight for my safety. The perception is that my security is more important than your security, because you wake up in the morning and you want to kill me, so I have to kill you before you kill me. And I have to protect my family, and that's why I have to kill you. And so all this isolation and a lot of misinformation that are at the root causes of the conflict. And so what do we do? How do we shift this from this perception of the other is a threat and my enemy to the other is my partner in building this peace that I'm so longing for?
I really share the way that you're describing the risk. And I think, firstly, even without technology, that sort of instinct of wanting to self-preserve and protect is human and it's natural. So as we do things in our society and build the physical and the digital infrastructure and institutions so that our society evolves, we do need to acknowledge that we are perhaps fearful beings, right? And that's part of our human instincts, our survival mechanisms. Where I find it disappointing, unacceptable, and even outrageous is when we allow, initially in the last couple decades, media to present us with just one view that then triggers that fear. And now tech design, which again further filters out our perspectives, makes us feel a sense of righteousness that is unable to then incentivize us to be able to value those qualities of curiosity and empathy and seeking of understanding, which need a little bit of extra help. because we are, as humans, we will be afraid. It doesn't take too much to make somebody feel afraid. Many people who develop hatred towards others have had no lived experience of violence, right? You've
Yeah.
seen that. They are
Yeah.
just extrapolating it, and that's enough for them to
Yeah.
not only feel fear, which can manifest as hatred, which can lead to the support or even the use of violence. So that's the thing when I then come back to where my focus is today, is that technology is everywhere in our lives. And each of those interactions with technology, I ask the question, is this helping us to be more comfortable with diversity, with pluralistic thinking, with an understanding that there may not be one truth, but rather 1 million truths? Or is it doing the opposite? And because the peace building field and those looking at social cohesion have often been at the margins and are often less loud than others who are driving technology and the products in a certain direction, that's why we've gotten to this place today. And so I think it's really important for us to, as peace activators and me working in this intersection between technology, design, and peace, to really expand the circles of allies and champions who come to see this. Because whatever your goal for society is, where you think tech can help you, better healthcare, better education, better city planning, or simply more productive work, none of those things are going to go very well if you have people that feel isolated, angry, and fearful, and are just not developing the skills to be able to engage across plurality and diversity and feel comfortable with that. And earlier in the conversation, you mentioned gender and women. I see that this technology is also doing a lot to increase the divide between men and women. I think there's a real pressure on men that oftentimes we don't look at. We look a lot at the harms of what we call tech facilitated gender based violence, of how women are being abused and sextorted. But men are also being incentivized towards spaces of misogyny that they didn't ask for, that they're being drawn into. They're being incentivized again because of our human fundamental needs and desires for acceptance, for acknowledgement, for feeling that sense of belonging into spaces that are full of hatred because of the incentives of the tech design. And that is also really a very big concern for me. I think we're going to see that coming up in the next 5 to 10 years, some real challenges on gender relationships that's been tech aggravated.
I agree with you. I so see that as well. And I think that's where inner transformation is key for the collective change. I think that's where having an inner muscle that allow us to discern, because I think the key here is also how do we discern, where do we engage, and how do we create alternative spaces for those that are created. And I think that's part of the work that you're doing with tech and peace building. And so how do you see that? How do you see that inner transformation can influence collective change, and how can we use tech to support that, so that we're seeing tech and AI not as a threat, but actually as an ally that would help us in this new venture?
Maybe I can offer two things that I'm paying attention to that I think offer promise. One is that the degree of trust in generative AI chatbots is higher than people's trust in their elected leaders. So 30% more trust in chatbots than in their elected leaders, and believing that the chatbot would have their best interest in mind. So there's something that's been developed in this last period by the designers of these technologies that understand our human vulnerabilities, our human nature, that has made us feel heard and listened in ways that many parts of society are not making us feel. Now, what do we do with that? We can see the horrific cases of people being drawn into self-harm and suicide. We can see the psychophancy of these chatbots pushing people into delusion. And more is being written and studied about this. But we can also ask ourselves as peace activators, what is it about that technology that if properly fine-tuned, that if properly customized, could become a really helpful ally to us in our journey of inner growth and transformation. And so I personally have built custom chatbots to act as a coach that I've found very helpful. We have highlighted as part of the Tech and Social Cohesion Substack an example of a Sudanese peace-building organization that's created a custom chatbot that only refers to 3,500 documents about the Sudan peace process and women's involvement, and a library of all previous peace accords and the many constitutions that country's been through, as a way of saying, look, we're here to help. And we know that the chatbot relationality works for people, but let's actually then scope it. So that's one example that I think people shouldn't shy away for all of the reasons that the technology has been built, stealing the data, stealing the internet, et cetera. I still believe that there's some good things that it can do in terms of real customization, fine-tuning, making it smaller and really serving our needs. And the other thing is that I mentioned earlier how polarizing I think many of the major social media platforms is in terms of pulling us apart and putting us into this cycle of outrage and making us believe that no one agrees on anything in this world today, which itself is a conclusion that certainly wouldn't make you believe it's the time to stand up and make a change, right? If no one else seems to be making a change. So that's where I believe that there are many other kinds of technologies, Polis, Remesh, Talk to the City, Agora, other kinds of platforms that exist that are designed for deliberation, that are designed for listening, that can be used by people mostly for free to really begin to, again, remind us, what does a good conversation look like? And how can that happen online? And how can we use technology to reach and expand our circles of inclusion and belonging and use technology for that? And right now, Eva, that technology is very fringe. It's hardly being used. There's places like Taiwan and some cities around the world where people are feeling like their voice matters, where it's a good experience to be in deliberation with others that they don't agree with. Maybe they change their view along the way, and they get to an outcome that they're all ready to defend. And that's really what we want to do when we see conflict transformation as a process. How do you take people who either for real or perceived reasons don't agree and get them to an outcome that they're all ready to defend because they see themselves in that outcome? And I think tech can do that when it's designed right.
That's an amazing example, so concrete and practical. And I love that. Yeah, I can actually see that. And you're seeing that, you're creating that. Part of this is coming from imagination and creativity and seeing what if. It's really the experiment. What if we do this instead of that? What would happen? And I think the question of what if is really at the base of any creation. What if this is possible? And so coming to an end to what if peace is possible, I would like to ask you, who have been your greatest mentor or inspiration along your path?
I think the people that have consistently given me hope about change is possible are people that have been, I'm trying to use a better word, have survived violence, let me say.
Yeah.
Survivors of violence who could be justifiably full of anger and full of hatred and could sit in a righteous space for the rest of their lives and have chosen not to. And in doing so, have really been so helpful to just activating and replicating so many other, just giving permission to others to do the same. And I saw that in South Africa with people ready to reconcile after decades of war, oppression, and apartheid. Of course, in the Great Lakes region. I've seen this in the United States with people who've moved, whether it was from what we would call an extremism, an Islamist type of extremism, or a white right extremism. And what we call the people who were the ex-members of these movements, I've just been always inspired by them because they've understood the path they went through and the path that their perpetrators went through to get to that place of supporting extreme violence. And they've come out of that. And I see examples of that in the Middle East conflict as well. Sadly, they're often not given enough space to speak about that journey of transformation. They're, of course, often silenced by people calling them traitors because this conflict is still ongoing. But people like that, I think, have really been an inspiration to me because they've lived through things that I haven't, but yet with them as a peace builder, I've been able to activate so many others in this journey.
Beautiful. That's a beautiful landing. Thank you so much, Lena. I love you.
Thank you too, Eva. And you can count on me as a forever champion of this work that you're leading. We call it peace activation today. It will be whatever it is, it will endure. And it's needed each and every day. And I really hope that so many others can join forces with you because it's something that gives us all that permission to say, yes, we've been through this conflict and we want to actually, again, make that change, make that transformation, not be held imprisoned by what we've experienced, but rather build new futures and new relationships. And I think your work is giving people the courage, the strength, and the compassion to do.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening, for feeling, and for holding space with us. If this episode moved you, please support the Peace is Possible podcast by subscribing, sharing it with friends, or posting it online. Every ripple counts. We'll be back next month with another conversation that dives deep into what it truly means to activate peace within and around us. To support the vision behind Peace Activation, visit peaceactivation.org and follow along on social media. You'll find both Peace Activation and me, Eva Dalak, across all platforms. Until next time, may you meet yourself and others with peace.